Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Chair Powell, it's great to see you again. Thank you for the good work you're doing. I think in response to friend Senator Tester's questions, and when you were talking about the kind of investments we ought to be making that are long-term, particularly as we're thinking about infrastructure, one of the areas, and understanding what my friend Senator Scott just said in your answer, that you don't want to weigh in on the president's most recent plan, I would like you, though, to comment whether you believe that broadband investments fall into that category of the kind of long-term structural change we need. I would argue over the last 11 months we've seen that broadband is a necessity. I think it is absolutely COVID related. I hope that the current package can be changed to actually include a sizable investment in broadband. As good as our four packages, bipartisan packages, have been to date, the broadband investment has been meager or non-existent. Experts like Tom Wheeler and Blair Lemon have said somewhere in the $40 to $50 billion range, we could get about 97% coverage along with better affordability. So I guess I'm asking, would you agree that immediate efforts to close the broadband gap not only represent long-term investments, but also have some direct relationship to the current healthcare crisis?
So as you and I have discussed on a number of occasions, I would agree that broadband is kind of a classic 21st century infrastructure and one of those things that can support growth. But I of course, don't want to go anywhere near the question of what should be included in the package, if that's okay.
What about the question, though, from a macroeconomic standpoint, broadband and trying to close the digital divide, if we're going to have a fulsome recovery across all socioeconomic groups, could you speak to the question of the necessity for broadband to be ubiquitous if we're going to have that kind of robust recovery, and comments about whether broadband is at this point a nice to have or an economic necessity, whether it's telework, telehealth, or teleeducation?
No, so again, as you and I have discussed on a number of occasions, I would agree that it is a classic piece of infrastructure for the modern economy, for the service economy, for the technologically advanced economy, and having it broadly available just could mean as broadly available as possible could be a significant benefit economically.
If not broadly available, are we going to be able to see the kind of broad-based recovery that I think we're all looking for?
Well, I think we have a bunch of issues to deal with that relate to these persistent disparities that we see to do with education and training and all those things. But that would certainly be one of those things.
Senator Scott, in his previous line of questioning, raised the inflation issues, and I know we've seen about a 41 basis point increase on some of our 10-year benchmarks. It's still relatively small. I tend to agree. I think we do need to make a sizable investment right now. I'm not sure the inflation risks, I agree with you, are not as high as potentially might be. Could you just briefly give some of the tools you've got available as Federal Reserve Chair if you started to see inflation rise at a level that you didn't feel comfortable with?
Well, those are the classic tools that we have. Again, I really do not expect that we'll be in a situation where inflation rises to troubling levels. At this point, the Federal Open Market Committee is seeking inflation running moderately above 2% for some time. So the real question is, as we go through this, are we going to find ourselves in a situation where inflation expectations are de-anchored and inflation is moving up and is persistent? And I think we're all very, acquainted with the history of how we got into that situation in the 1970s. We did that in the 1960s, and we have no intention of repeating that. So central banks and the Fed learned how to keep it, the centrality of keeping inflation under control. We know how to do that. And that's just by not allowing the economy to just ignore constraints over time. But I think this is not a problem for this time as near as I can figure. And if it does turn out to be, then we do have the tools we need.
We're down to my last 20 seconds, and but let me just, if you want to make some general comments, I mean, I would argue that the pandemic was the first major real-world stress test we've had on our fiscal system since 2009. How do you think overall the system has responded? And recognizing, Mr. Chairman, that'll be my last question. He's obviously, you may want to take that one for the record, but if you want to make some general comments quickly.
You meant financial system, I think, right?
Right. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, I think the large financial institutions that are at the heart of our financial system proved resilient. They did, and they've been able to keep lending, and their capital levels have actually gone up during this period. As I mentioned, their liquidity levels are at highs. So I think that the work that we did over the course of the last decade and some has held up pretty well so far, and I expect it'll continue to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Powell.
Thank you, Senator Warner.